Oh, hello. Welcome to another thrilling episode of Denton's Tales. And in this video, we continue the story of Ivarr the Boneless. And we look at the question, the very, very interesting question, which always is brought up when Ivarr is mentioned. Why was he called boneless? Was he actually lacking in bones? Did he have some medical condition? Or was it simply that now how can I put this delicately, that he couldn't get it up, so to speak? Well, we'll be asking that question and looking for answers shortly. But first, we return to the great heathen army as they continue to knock the stuffing out of the Anglo-Saxons. In 867 AD, Ivarr the Boneless and the great heathen army marched into the kingdom of Mercia, capturing the city of Nottingham, where they spent the winter. King Burgred of Mercia requested assistance from King Ethelred of Wessex, who, along with his brother Alfred, the future King Alfred the Great, arrived with an army and laid siege to Nottingham, and completely failed to achieve anything at all, being quite unable to penetrate the defences, and Ivarr had absolutely no intention of leaving the city to fight them, since, well, he had no need to do so. Why leave the city to fight and take casualties when all he had to do was sit behind the walls in safety, looking out at the besieging forces and, well, basically going in their general direction. Now, not everyone saw it that way, of course. One Henry of Huntingdon, a chronicler writing some 250 years after the event, and thus clearly knowing everything about it, he put it thus, and I quote, "Ingvar, then, seeing that the whole force of England was there gathered, and that his host was the weaker, and was there shut in, betook himself to smooth words, cunning fox that he was, and he won peace and troth from the English. Then he went back to York, and he abode there 1 year with all cruelty." Well, of course he did. He was one of those Viking chaps, so of course he was a villain. Now, you know how it goes. King Burgred, seeing the stalemate, decided to buy the Vikings off. A bit of cash always works wonders. Agreeing a truce with them that saw them return to Northumbria in the autumn of 868, where they remained, consolidating and gathering strength for their next campaign. And of course, anybody who thought that buying the Vikings off was a very good idea soon found out that what that usually resulted in was they came back for more. Anyway, their next campaign took them back again to East Anglia. The invasion of East Anglia was launched in 869, with the intention this time of full conquest. Oh, no dodgy peace deals in return for horses. All that messing about. No, forget that. And they seized the town of Thetford. King Edmund, having finally realized that horse trading was rather a poor defensive strategy, at last decided to put up a fight. Now, good for him. And about time, too. And he arrived with an army, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but unfortunately he was just as useless this time around as he had been the first time, and he was captured and killed. Following his death, Edmund was declared a martyr for the faith, and he was actually made a saint as well, since tradition said that he had refused the Danish demands to renounce Christ, and that Ivarr and Ubbe were responsible for his death, which, according to legend at least, resulted in his being shot full of arrows like Saint Sebastian, after him telling the Norsemen how God had protected the saint. God protected Saint Sebastian. Arrows were fired at him, but God protected him. Ivarr, quite reasonably I suppose, decided to see if God would do the same for Edmund. Unfortunately, he didn't. Edmund died somewhat resembling a pincushion. That's the legend, but exactly how he died in the battle or afterwards, we really don't know for certain, nor what part Halfdan played in that event, and which isn't mentioned at all. In the 10th century, a monk named Abbo of Fleury wrote that Edmund was hit with numerous what he called javelins, and then, I quote, When Hingwa, the wicked seaman, saw that the noble king would not deny Christ, but with steadfast faith ever called upon him, he commanded men to behead him, and the heathen did so. For while he was yet calling upon Christ, the heathen drew away the saint to slay him, and struck off his head with a single blow, and his soul departed joyfully to Christ. Yes, we must be grateful, I suppose, that he was so joyful at being shortened by a head. In 870 AD, Ivarr seems to have withdrawn from any participation in the further activities of the great army, since he renewed his partnership with his co-ruler in Dublin, Ivarr the White, launching a two-pronged attack on Scotland, Ivarr leading one group from Jorvik, while Ivarr sailed up the Firth of Clyde with a considerable fleet. Eventually, they joined forces at Dumbarton, which is the capital of the Britons of Strathclyde, or Strathclyde as it is today, which they besieged for 4 months, cutting off the garrison's water supply and forcing their surrender, after which they destroyed the fortress. The annals of Ulster saying that they besieged, razed, and pillaged it. And of course they did. I mean, they were Vikings. That's sort of what they did. But anyway, they remained in Strathclyde for the winter. Then they returned to Dublin in 871, loaded with booty and slaves, and having exacted tribute from Constantine I, king of Alba, leaving Halfdan Ubbe and Guthrum as the principal leaders of the great army, which over the next 7 years conquered almost all of England, with the exception of the kingdom of Wessex. But that's another story. Well, Ivarr continued to rule Dublin until his death, which according to both the Annals of Ulster and the fragmentary Annals of Ireland occurred in 873 AD. Now, the Anglo-Saxon historian Ethelweard gives the date of his death as being 870 AD. Of course, that is clearly an error, since he was very much alive in that year raiding Scotland. And if he was dead, he was certainly a lively corpse. Well, the walking dead, how are you? Well, another account has him dying in a shipwreck in 878, which again seems pretty unlikely. So I think we should go with the two annals as regarding the departure from this world of Ivarr. Now, he left a considerable legacy, founding the greatest Viking dynasty in Ireland, or indeed anywhere else for that matter, known as the Ivarr, meaning the descendants of Ivarr, though that title actually included Ivarr himself and his contemporaries. And there is no indication that he ever married or had children, so he had no direct descendants by blood, though the title would have referred to all those around him as well, his retainers and so on. Now, as I said, there is no historical, or indeed mythological, record of him ever being married or having children, despite that event being shown in the television series Vikings, which is hardly famous for its actual historical accuracy. Indeed, it's rather famous for having no historical accuracy. Well, that's television for you. Now, he would have been very wealthy, having derived considerable sums from the slave trade. I mean, there being enormous profits to be had in the slave trade from both the international trade in slaves itself, often sent as far as the slave markets of Francia, or even further to Constantinople, and from the very heavy taxes that was levied upon it. Indeed, Dublin became the principal slave trading centre in Western Europe, drawing the, merchandise, I suppose we could call them, from the Irish hinterland as well as raids across the sea. Excavations here in Dublin have uncovered numerous slave chains, iron neck rings linked together by chains, rather like the chain gangs they used to have in American prisons, and that would have secured a number of slaves in a row, as well as individual iron neck collars. Not really the sort of fashion accessory that one would particularly want to wear. Ireland, incidentally, was one of the last places in Europe to give up the practice of slavery, despite the efforts of the church in later years to stop it, probably because it was very profitable. Ivarr was described as the king of the Norsemen, of all Ireland and Britain. Well, a very modest title that he may have actually given to himself. But, why not? Clearly he deserved it, and he was considered a brilliant military strategist, something the TV show actually portrays correctly. How amazing. The claim of being the king of Britain as well was not actually boastful, though it might sound so, because he could indeed include Britain in it, since the Norse kingdom of Dyflin actually included a considerable area along the west coast of Britain, from around where Liverpool now is and further north. The Hebrides was also, the islands of Hebrides were also included, and parts of Scotland, thanks to King Olaf's marriage to Aud Ketilsdottir, known as Aud the Deep Thinker, whose family just happened to control the Hebrides, which is probably the reason he married her in the first place. And she would later become one of the greatest figures in the early history of Iceland. Now we come to the big question. Whether or not Ivarr was actually crippled to any great extent is a matter of debate, given his military prowess, and he was described as being a very large man, standing well above most others, and a capable warrior, as well as being very strong, cunning, and skillful. But you see, here's the problem. A severely physically handicapped, capable warrior, well, that seems rather doubtful, to say the least. But there's really no way to give a definitive answer, given the conflicting accounts of him, nor are there any Anglo-Saxon reports of anyone ever meeting him and describing him physically, though I'm sure many Anglo-Saxons did meet him. Of course, how many were still alive afterwards to talk about it is, well, that's quite another matter. Some saga accounts describe him as having weak bones, having cartilage instead of bone, or no bones at all, which of course is a medical impossibility. I mean, he wouldn't be able to stand up. He'd just sort of flop like a big blancmange or a jelly. And they refer to him as being carried around on a shield, which, though it sounds plausible at first sight, would actually have been a very awkward mode of transport, especially for such a large man, and a positive hazard in battle. Making it questionable, to say the least. Since Viking shields were round and they weren't very large, I mean, there's one of them over there, and certainly not designed for carrying very big men around on them, which frankly would have been all but impossible, other than perhaps using one to help drag a wounded man off the battlefield. Get a typical Viking shield like that and put a big man on it, like, say, Jason Momoa or The Rock. Put them on it and see how you get on trying to carry them around. Victorious leaders would sometimes, of course, be lifted up and carried on enemy shields as a sign of victory, but that was just for a very brief time, and they would not have tried to go into battle in that manner, nor to be carried around like that as a usual mode of transport, making that, I think, exceedingly unlikely in Ivarr's case. He could, of course, actually have been carried, not on shields, but in a litter of some sort, on a sort of stretcher or in a bag. But, once again, well, that hardly sounds like a great warrior of the 9th century who men would willingly follow into battle. Hold on, let me get out of my little bag here. Hold me up, lads, so I don't fall down, and I'll swing my... No, I don't really think that holds water. That degree of hero worship, required a bit more than being lugged around by a bear party in a bag or a box or something, and really unable to fight at all. That was not the stuff of heroic warriors by a long way. Now, yes, he could have had weak bones. There are medical conditions that would have made standing or walking difficult. And if he was exceedingly tall, well, of course, that would increase any bone problems he might have by his sheer size, such as the tallest man that we know of who ever lived, Robert Pershing Wadlow, who was almost 9 feet tall and needed braces on his leg to walk, a bit like Ivarr in the TV show. But such a condition in the Viking age, where strength and fighting ability were so greatly regarded, well, it would hardly enable someone to become a great warlord. Interestingly enough, the Ragnarssonafalter, the tale of Ragnar's sons, suggests male impotence. Yes. Like his bonelessness was simply figurative, an early play on the term boner for an erection, I suppose. And in that case, tales of his physical handicap may well have been an attempt to hide that rather embarrassing fact. For any Norseman, and especially a great and famous warrior like Ivarr Ragnarsson, being impotent would be a considerable embarrassment, and it could call the succession of any children he might have into question. Not, of course, that he actually had any children. And in that case, it could also be the reason he didn't have any children or a wife, unable to actually have the former and too embarrassed to have the latter. No, the wedding night would have been a bit of a letdown. The 13th century Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, writing in his Gesta Danorum, the history of the Danes, he doesn't even mention any physical defect with Ivarr, which seems very strange. If he was handicapped to that degree, surely it would have been meriting a mention. And as I've said, it's highly questionable that a severe physical deformity, such as a lack of bones, would have allowed him to become a great leader in that day and age. In fact, he would have been very lucky even to survive childhood. Another suggestion, and quite a plausible one, I have to say, is that he was extremely flexible in movement, seeming to have no bones because of his flexibility, what in his case we today might call double-jointed. Now, that seems, I suppose, quite likely. That is possible that he could have moved in some sort of a fluid way, the way a cat moves, or a hamster that can flatten itself and go under a door. And then people could have said, he mustn't have any bones in him. And later writers, relying after all on verbal tales handed down from mouth to mouth, because the Old Norse didn't write things down, and the sagas and poems weren't written until the 13th century, they could have misunderstood or misrepresented the verbal tales, which themselves were probably already pretty distorted by constant retelling. That is something you have to take into account when you're using things that have been handed down from one person to another. The only contemporary written records are those such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and some of the Irish annals. And even the likes of Saxo are writing down the old stories hundreds of years later. And if you wrote down something your grandfather told you that his father had said he was told by his father, who'd got it from his grandfather, who heard it from his mother, whose great aunt had heard it from somebody or other in the marketplace once, I don't think you would actually have a very accurate record of what was actually said. The reason for his deformity, according to Ragnar's saga, was that his mother, Åslaug, who was also a Volva, had told Ragnar that he must wait 3 days before having intercourse with her after he had returned from a raid, or else there would be repercussions. She said, 3 nights together, but yet apart shall we bide, nor worship the gods as yet. From my son this would save a lasting harm, for boneless is he thou wouldst now beget. Unfortunately, that did not stop the begetting. Ragnar, having been away from her for some time and suffering the sexual withdrawal symptoms so often associated with seafarers, he couldn't restrain himself. And he bedded her right there and then. And the result was baby Ivarr with wonky legs. The saga saying, the boy was boneless, as if there were gristle where his bones should be. When he was young, he was grown so large that no one was his equal. He was the handsomest of all men, and so wise that it wasn't certain whether there had ever been a wiser man than that. Rather strange, the bonelessness and his being so wonderful mentioned in the same... Anyway, the things about his size and wisdom may well have been true, but that a baby so handicapped would have been allowed to live is highly unlikely, even if he were the son of a very important man, who would, probably, in fact, that would make it even worse. A very important man would probably not want his importance to be lowered by such an offspring. A child who could be seen as a punishment from the gods for something, or as a reflection on his sexual prowess that he produced. Such a crippled child. I wouldn't want people thinking that. And such a child's chances of ever becoming a great leader of men, and a king to boot, or even being alive to do so, would have been rather slim. Though Ivarr did exist, unlike Ragnar Lothbrok, who didn't, And his brothers, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, and Ubbe are also historical figures. I mean, there are numerous references to them in historical documents rather than sagas. Ubbe, for example, we know took part in the Battle of Sinwit in Devonshire, or Devonshire as it is today, in 878 AD, where he was killed by Odur, the ealdorman of Devon. A great deal of Ivar's story is unfortunately partly historical fact and partly saga storytelling, which may or may not be correct, especially the idea of his bonelessness as some form of physical deformity, since some aspects of that seem to contradict other aspects of it. A lot of saga material, you see, is actually factual, but a great deal is also either highly romanticized or total fiction, a bit like a Hollywood true story, in which only the names haven't been changed. You know, they were stories for entertainment or educational purposes rather than a genuine record of actual historical events. Now, I have tried to follow, for the most part, the things about him that can be related to known historical facts, rather than some of the tales of him in the sagas, which are, well, they're really nice stories, they're lovely, but they can't be verified by historical record, and sometimes they're just far too lurid and improbable, if not impossible, to be anything but just that, nice stories. For example, one tale has him meeting the King of Sweden in battle, but the Swedish king, oh, devious man, he had a secret weapon, a magic cow. Yes, you heard correctly, a magic cow. And this fearsome bovine beast is decimating Ivar's men. He's knocking them left, right, and centre like 10 pins. So Ivarr tells his warriors to make an enormous bow using a large tree. Yeah, I mean, trees are very flexible. You can make them into bows. And then, still sitting on the shield he's riding on, he draws the tree bow as if it were a flimsy elm twig, and he shoots the cow with it, ping, hitting her in the face and blinding her. Now, where they got a huge bowstring and a suitable arrow, I don't know, or indeed a tree you could make into a bow, though trees aren't really very bendy, but they did. Now, the cow is mightily pissed off about that when having an arrow stuck in her eye, and goes on a great rampage. But Ivarr has a backup plan. Oh yes, Ivarr goes to plan B, and he tells his men to throw him at the cow. Yes, lift him up and throw him. He must have had incredibly strong soldiers with him, which they do, and his great size crushes the unfortunate cow. The cow is now a rather messy puddle. The warriors pick Ivarr up, stick him back up on the shield, and he addresses his army. His voice, so powerful that every man hears him as clearly as if he was standing shoulder to shoulder with them. Who needs megaphones and loudspeakers? An exciting tale, to be sure. Oh, yes, an exciting tale, and also a load of pure horse shit. Or, in this case, cow dung. So, too, probably, is the famous story of King Aelle being killed by Ivarr and his brothers with the dreadful punishment known as the blood eagle, where someone's ribs are broken and their lungs were supposed to be pulled out of their back and they'd hang there like wings. But the problem with that is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle makes absolutely no mention of it. And had a Saxon king been pulled apart by nasty Norsemen, I'm sure they would have, even if it was only for some good old anti-Viking propaganda. But no, not a word, which casts considerable doubt on the story. Also, the blood eagle itself is highly questionable from a historical point of view, there being little actual evidence for it ever having been used. But again, it makes for a good story. You know, blood and guts always adds a bit of spice to an otherwise unimpressive story. I mean, okay, somebody just got their head whacked off. Well, boring, happens all the time. But, their ribs were broken and their lungs were pulled out and the lungs were flapping around there like wings. Oh, much better as a story to tell around the fire on a cold winter night. Regardless of whether he was the product of uncontrollable sexual desire and couldn't walk properly, or he simply couldn't get it up, as they say, whether he was or was not carried on a shield, we know enough about him to say that he was a remarkable man, a great military leader, and a commanding figure in the history of both Ireland and Britain. And he deserves his status as one of the most famous of all Viking leaders. I hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. So for the moment, I shall say farewell and goodbye for now.